Good morning, and thank you for having me. So my name is Erwin Kho, and I was the art director and art lead for COCOON. And today I want to share with you some insights that went into the research and the ideas for developing the visual designs of the game, and also a little bit how it relates to my own work. But first, let's start off with a little introduction. So yeah, we released Cocoon in September of last year, and it's the first game by the Danish studio Geometric Interactive, which is founded by Jeppe Carlsen, who was the lead gameplay designer for Limbo and Inside, and audio designer Jacob Schmidt. And we're really happy with the positive response that it has received, and of course I'm mostly happy that people had some nice things to say about the art. And it was the first time for me working on a game of this scope. I don't come from a game development background. I have a background in graphic design and illustration, which you can maybe tell from the very stylized look of the game. And I ended up working like about 6.5 years on it. So it was quite a journey to get to this point. And you can see here that Cocoon started out with very humble beginnings. It's footage from the gameplay prototype from 2017, and back then it was called Universe. And Jeb and Jacob let me play it, and it convinced me to join the project. And so the conceit of the game is that you navigate through the world and you come across these orbs that you can pick up and take with you and solve environmental puzzles with. But you can also warp into these orbs, and inside them there's a whole new world to explore, and you find other orbs that you can then also take with you. And then over the course of the game you learn to take orbs into other orbs, and then you learn to juggle this hierarchy of worlds within worlds and solve puzzles that way. But as you can see, they didn't start off with a whole lot of art. So before I move on, let me give you a little bit of context of my own work so that the rest of Cocoon maybe makes a little bit more sense. I graduated in visual communication at an art school in the Netherlands, and it was an education that, especially in the first year, it exposed me to many different disciplines of art, from painting to sculpture, photography, ceramics, screen printing, everything. And it really helped me to appreciate the diversity of art and how it's influenced by its mediums. And the visual communication department that I chose was not so much focused on the technical aspect of design. It was more focused on developing concepts and translating briefs into interesting visual ideas. And I sadly don't have a whole lot of work left over from that time, but I did find these things. These are renders from my graduation project. This was when 3D printing started to become a little bit more accessible and affordable for the masses, and we had this promise of Web 2.0. We're supposed to revolutionize the web and bring people together. We know how that went. But these jewels here, they're physical representations of a person's online profile, and the content of a person's online identity would be reflected in the design of each of these objects, and that would then be custom 3D printed. And so for the first few years of my career, I worked at design studios, and we'd work for a variety of clients, mostly very corporate work. We'd work on developing branding, designing logos, do marketing, annual reports, motion graphics, websites, and that sort of thing. And so I've learned a lot on those projects, but I did feel the need to have something that was creatively a little bit more satisfying for myself. So in my spare time, I would continue to just tinker in 3D software. And I ended up gravitating to a way of modeling that was very much inspired by like late 90s, early 2000s models, like quite low polygonal. And also, I didn't have like a very strong computer at the time, so keeping it rather simple made a lot of sense to me. And then working with the limitations of my computer, I started creating these islands, like these little miniature biomes inspired by like terrariums, and God knows how many hours I played with Lego. And so from the get-go, I was very interested in creating these very simple and striking silhouettes and volumes. And I think a great deal of that I owe to, for example, like the modernist works of Charlie Harper and his famous stylized wildlife illustrations. And I really love the look of clay renders. So just letting the shapes and volumes speak for themselves without any distraction of color or texture. So I gravitated towards this very limited color palettes from quite early on. And then as I continue working on my methods and my style, I was represented by an agency in Amsterdam, and we worked together on a variety of clients, like for instance, this for the Aruba Tourism Office. It's an ad campaign that featured like a handful of posters, and they were my first big client as a freelancer. And the minimal composition of my own work was also like very heavily influenced by isolated scientific imagery, like biology and anatomy plates and infographics. So I was often approached for doing that sort of work. And then once in a while, I would return to my island series and then continue developing those ideas further. And here I started to incorporate the 2D vector elements more into like the main subject. And I wanted to give those elements like a different feel of materiality. So in contrast to the 3D main elements, they can feel maybe a bit more ghost-like or more flimsy, or they can maybe convey things like lens flares or seeds or pollen and something of a very different order of material. And my commissioned work was always very, very illustrative, very figurative. So in my own series, my work became more and more stylized and abstract. And then making isolated imagery like this for me is a little bit like you're painting a still life. So your possibility space is very restricted, and it makes it, for me, like very soothing to work on, because the elements are very easy to keep under control, and I can focus on just the shapes and the right measure of stylization, which is a little bit different when you then have to make like screen-wide immersive environments. So when I landed the job for COCOON, I was the only artist, and for at least the first year or so. So I got to design all the different elements of the game, environments, gameplay elements, the characters, orbs and war portals. So it was a little bit overwhelming, and we had a lot of talks about where do we take this game. And we all really like the sci-fi genre, so we started throwing ideas around, like what could the backstory for a game be in a sci-fi setting. And these images here, they show some of the first concepts where I'm trying to get a feel for working with the isometric view and the camera angle and the distance and everything. I'm trying to get a feel for what a game screen could look like, but I'm also aware to develop the different personalities for each of the worlds, because we knew that because of the warping in and out of the worlds, each world should be really distinct and be instantly recognizable to the player. And I wanted the landscape of the orb also to relate to the orb's ability. And I started off thinking the first two orbs that you find, like those abilities were already really clear. The first orb that you can see here, it allows you to manifest these invisible bridges inside of other worlds. So it made me think of traversing heights, because why else would you need a bridge? And the first orb, you find it while you're inside this gray world. And for that world, we imagined it could be a hub of sorts from which this civilization has spread throughout the solar system. So maybe that world could be very industrialized, and the landscape would be mined, and pieces would be stripped away. And I like the idea of maintaining a very gray color scheme for this world, so that any other orb that you would find within it would contrast really nicely with it. And so for the first orb, because of the idea of verticality, I started to look at like North American canyons and rock formations, So I was leaning into it being this mountainous, rocky world from quite early on. And at the same time, also considering the second orb that you find. So in the prototype, the second orb has like a rhythmic ability to it. It would make objects solid and passable like on a beat. And it was green colored already. So when looking for a contrast with the first orb, the idea of this lush and wet world with lots of vegetation came to mind. So it's not just a color contrast that I'm looking for. I'm also looking for a contrast in biome types. And as you can see, like these were close to the type of work that I was familiar with creating. These images here, they function a little bit like orb-style portraits in a way, to get a little bit of a sense of the personality for each of the orbs and the biomes within them. And as I was developing the identities further, I decided to contrast the tall cliffs of the first orb. So I wanted the green orb to be very flat. So combined with the idea of vegetation and water, it led me to conceptualize that world as this really swamp-covered world, or something maybe close to a mangrove forest. And where in the first orb, the boundaries of the playing field would be defined by cliffs. For the second one, it would be the water that restricts the player movement within the playing field. And so, I did feel quite uncertain about all these different ideas that I had to parse. But one thing that came quite easy to me was the design of plants, as I've done that many times before. So actually a lot of the plant models that you see here and then plant models made during the time, they actually still are in the final game. And I think plants are a really interesting design subject, especially when you need to do trees, because those canopies, they're so complicated, and then the question becomes, how do you convey the sense of a canopy but don't model every single leaf? And I would rather not default to painting the leaf canopy in textures. Like I want to find a solution in the polygonal way of modeling as much as possible. So what worked for me here was creating first these clusters of very simplified silhouettes, and then canopies are not solid, like they have like gaps in them. So by deleting some of those polygons, I'll break up the shape and bring back that sense of a layer that isn't solid. And one other decision that also allowed myself was the use of gradients in the alpha channel. So you get the sense of the canopy cluster being really dense, like close to the branch. And as it moves away from the branch, it becomes more transparent. So the idea is similar to like an actual canopy tree. It's just like very stylized down to its essence. And then in these algae patches for our swamp world, you can see how the geometry of the polygons takes lead in shaping the look of the algae. So it's just diamond-shaped polygons, and then some of them get deleted. And so while I'm doing that, at the same time, I'm also designing the protagonist. And we decided early on that we really liked the idea of this character being born or created for this task of traversing worlds within worlds. And so this isn't some random character who just stumbles into the adventure, like he has a purpose to him. And so with these sketches, what they have in common is that they're designed with like large clamps or grabbers, something to carry an orb with. And I remember having conversations with Jebbe about this, like it'd be nice if you would see the function of the protagonist in his design somehow. So we ended up with this character inspired by an astronaut, and at the time, there's so many games featuring astronauts, so I thought like, oh, I'll just give him a cape to make him look like an adventurer. But a cape is also a little bit lame, so I decided to split his cape into two to echo the two clamps that he has on his back. And then playtesters started commenting on it, like, is he a bug? Is he a beetle? Is he a fly? Like, because of the cape, it reminded them of insect wings. And then at this point, we felt that he lacked like a certain kind of charisma, and we would like for the protagonist to be a bit more friendly or charming or accessible somehow. So this here is some footage from our first vertical slice. And we have these different characteristics of the worlds, and they're quite clearly defined, most notably like their color schemes. But I felt that there's something missing on a more like holistic aesthetic level. There was something that I wasn't quite happy with. And I think it's because I've never done work with this before, and there was a lot I had to learn about designing the visuals for the playing fields and maintaining readability, making sure that borders read clearly, that sort of thing. And then with like, there was something clumsy about the cultural language. I didn't really have a clear enough direction. So it resulted in these buildings and technology being designed a little bit too randomly. and I didn't really know, how to finish them. I didn't really know what they needed to be. And so there's all these different visual aspects and ideas that needed to be stronger. And at this point, like influences from the world of invertebrates had already seeped into some of the designs a little bit. And so we had a lot of talks like, we're asking ourselves, like, why is this character doing these things and getting these orbs into other orbs? And where does he belong in the grand scheme of things? And so the idea that we settled on is that we're actually unfolding a solar system. There's a little bit of a spoiler, but it doesn't matter. It's a puzzle game. So we're unfolding a solar system from a sort of stasis, a bit like you're unpacking like zipped computer files. And I started thinking like the base building blocks of our solar system are its planets, and here they're folded into orbs. But then what are the building blocks of planets? Would that be like cells and molecules? And then what are the building blocks of those, like the atoms? And then what are the building blocks of atoms? And then if you go upwards in this recursive idea, like what comes after the solar system, well, that will be galaxies and so on. So the working title of universe actually seemed quite fitting. And we imagined that each of these levels of reality was actually folded up into orbs. And this recursive idea, it also implied that our protagonist isn't the only one of his kind doing this. And so we had these different ideas and inspirations that coming together. And I really liked the image of the ants carrying those objects, like many times their size and their weight, like without any effort, which also calls to mind like the image of like scarab beetles rolling around like balls of dung, or like Atlas carrying the wall on his shoulders. So our protagonist is actually a worker drone, like one out of many, tasked with unfolding their part of their level of reality and their level of the recursion. And I like that he's not special, but he does have a purpose. He's just not a unique chosen hero. And you can see here in these in these explorations that I'm looking for slightly more cartoony shapes, and especially around the hips, I wanted like lines that float a bit nicer, that are a bit more friendlier and finished looking. And the cape is now more embraced as the wing carapace of a beetle. And with the golden helmet here, like we still have that visor, it still looks a little bit robotic with like the Cyclops eye dot, but it looks a lot friendlier with just giving him a pair of eyes. So we're very happy with this new character design, especially with the eyes and with like the little antenna bunny ears. It makes him really relatable and really cute. And then later with the character animations, we were able to give him like a lot of personality. Like when he's idling, like sometimes he stretches, or sometimes he looks at different points of interest, or like when he's facing an opponent. And for the technology and architecture, I keep coming back to images like these. And what I like about these is that the delicate structural details together form these very simple orb silhouettes. And I like here like how the man-made and the natural shapes, they portray the same idea, the idea of protection, and everything is always encased in some other surrounding structure. And this then became like a recurring theme in how I started to approach the architecture. And with these images, I like how they convey like order, or like a clear pattern. In the top and the middle, there's this beautiful organic grid, and you can see that there's a clear repetition there, but it's never mechanically perfect. So you can clearly see that it's not a machine that created this. And on the top right, there's the close-up of the mouth parts of a crab. And those were very influential for our designs, because they look a bit like robot arms, but they're actually grown. And in the bottom and the middle, the radial pattern that you can often see like in marine life, like starfish or sea urchins, they were also a visual cue that I started to go back to over and over again. And another important idea was that the structures would be made from their immediate surroundings, like how insect nests are made. So these images were really inspiration to that end, where like the materials are very basic. It's just wood and mud, but they end up looking really beautiful and enigmatic. They have something timeless and monumental about them. And to me, like these structures, they speak of this non-human intelligence, like something that's quite different from us, but in a way you can still sort of relate to what they're doing and what they've made. So there's a sense of otherness there that I thought was interesting to use for an alien culture. And I was also thinking like this culture is so advanced, so of course they could just like manipulate the environment to grow buildings for them. And this building was probably most defining for the architecture, where I could really test this organic architectural style that I was leaning into. with this one, like all the different ideas, for me, they finally clicked and came together into a system that I found like aesthetically really beautiful and something I could rely on. So you can see here like the foundation of the design is still the circle, and we get these layers of like circles within circles, which also works as a conceptual callback to the game's idea of like worlds within worlds. And most importantly, it plays with the idea of protection with the tubing and machinery being sheltered inside these cover plate walls. And the idea of encapsulation protection was also really important to me when designing these spaces that we refer to as ancestor rooms. So it's the spaces where you find a new orb, which itself also encapsulates a world inside of it. And the design of the space was inspired by this image of the gall wasp larva inside of its gall. Like those are like tumorous plant growth that are induced by biological chemical agents, in this case by the gall wasp larva that hides inside of it and uses the gall as its home and its feeding ground. And at some point the larva will emerge from it once it has pupated into its adult stage. So it also functions as a protective cocoon. And then the exterior of that space is like an architectural cocoon inspired by this image of a chrysalis. And this photo in particular has been really inspiring for me. Like it captures the richness and sophistication that I'm looking for, and at the same time it's also like grown naturally. And we use a lot of rough earthen surfaces throughout the game, so any shiny element, it contrasts really nicely with that. And here you can see the idea of like the locally grown buildings, like reflected in the use of the materials in the outer walls. Like some of those and some of the pipes leaning into them, they're made from the same ground rock material around them. So parts of the building are like a little bit ambiguous. Like it has a material relationship with its surroundings. And parts of the environment seem to be industrialized or mechanical. And then we play with that ambiguity all the time. Like it's often not really clear where the architecture ends and where the landscape begins. So the boundary between technology and environment becomes a little bit blurred. And especially in this gray world, I wanted it to feel the most industrialized, like this hive culture has stripped this world of its resources and repurposed it so much that parts of the landscape have become mechanical. And so one way of expressing that was carving these rounded, elongated gaps that occur both in the architecture, but also for some reason in the topsoil layer of the surrounding landscape. And another important thing that you can notice here is the use of symmetry. And for me, like that allowed me to calm down my brain a lot and help me restrict my possibility space when designing these areas. So I realized that I do want to express like this very advanced and very coherent culture. But by breaking up that pattern of expectation a little bit, you loosen up the style and you give it a feeling of being grown rather than being mechanically produced. So here you can see that same area like top down. And you can see here like it's perfectly mirrored, which it appears like a little bit static or too static because we can easily detect the axis of mirroring down the middle, like left and right is exactly the same. But then we loosen it up by making the other half just a bit different, but not so different that the two halves lose cohesion. And we apply that idea everywhere throughout Cocoon. So also in our smaller assets, like for instance in this door, where everything's mirrored here. And then it just looks a tad nicer with some differences on the other side. So with that, we end up with this very consistent feel of the environments throughout Cocoon, because the architecture and often the landscape, it surrounds and encapsulates. And we can see that here applied into our green swamp world, where in the gray world, everything is carved out of rock. Here we imply that they've sculpted their buildings out of the local trees and plant life. And we end up with these monumental and almost like sacred-looking spaces. Your eyes are very easily drawn to the center, and that makes for a very coherent visual language. And the spaces, they always look very orderly and symmetrical, but never static and mirrored. There's always a certain looseness to them. And I imagine this civilization being at the height of their power, so they can fold entire worlds and solar systems into orbs. So I thought like their cultural appearance is inspired by bodies, and I wanted it to look graceful and sophisticated, and instead of disgusting. And the cicada wings, they have this beautiful aura to them, but one that is mechanical. So they reminded me of like stained glass and Art Deco designs. And I ended up using it to define these silhouettes of like thin metallic filigree and start applying those everywhere. And another important aspect was the use of this iridescent metal. So iridescence is quite common in Arthropod Kingdom, and I think it looks really magical. So I restricted its use to like these very specific elements. These here, we call them Dyson doors, and they cut through the black structures that hold the worlds together. And I wanted that opening sequence to look very special, because we want to signal to the player that lies beyond this is very important to this world. And I was looking at mouth parts of like mantis and crabs for inspiration. And you know, they look quite complicated, but they're a very interesting design reference. Which brings me to animation. So I imagine that if the technology is based in biology, then it's grown, and it's meant that the working should be grounded in how bodies work. So much in the same way that this culture has reshaped the landscape to suit its needs, they've done the same thing to bodies. Like looking at these videos, I realized we can have this wide variety of motion articulation without the use of any wheels. So I decided that this culture hasn't invented the cogwheel, which is something that we tend to associate with the human mind and human invention. And that then inspires, of course, the design of the technology. So there's all these rows of plates that flutter, inspired by comb jellies, and soft bodies can expand and contract. And then there's this sense of like insect body horror spread throughout Cocoon with the many arthropod limbs that are spread throughout the game. And you're seeing these elements that look like body parts that form machinery, but it's not really clear. Like, did they model this after the arthropod limb, or did they actually cannibalize the arthropod body and then just repurpose them as machines? So when we go back to our Dyson door from just now, we continue further higher up the cliffs and expressing the idea of verticality for this world. And then we quickly end up in our first boss area. And the design of these spaces is always very similar. Like you can see here again, like the pattern of the circle, and then the arrangement of the pillars, like they convey this idea of protection. And I wanted for these scenes to be like very clean and elegant and convey the sense of a cultural significance, something closer to a temple or maybe a gladiator arena. The bosses that you encounter in our game, we call them ancestors. And the idea behind them is that they're actually part of the same hive culture as our protagonist. And they are some of the protagonist's predecessors. And they've been on a similar journey in life. They're from the previous level of the recursion. So while you are busy unfolding a solar system, they were actually responsible for unfolding the world that they are now guarding. So they're not quite fighting you, rather they're testing you to see if you're ready to become the guardian of the orb that you're unfolding. And I wanted them to look like imposing adversaries. But just like the culture, I wanted them to also look graceful, and I imagined them more as a sort of angelic, evolved version of our protagonist. And for the gameplay prototype of our second boss, we had this mock-up boss model, like twirling around really fast in the arena. So that reminded me of like a shuriken, like a ninja star. So along with the aquatic theme of this world, it made me think of Starfish. So his star-shaped body plan was locked in quite early. And this world's resource is this green plant root system that produces spores that alter the state of matter. And so with this boss, I wanted its design to be fused with the roots, but to signal a close relation, but not in a grotesquely infected way. It should look more like a symbiosis. So hence his arms and his breathing tubes are made from those green roots. And when it's in its vulnerable state, the roots are the ones that form this protective shell around the boss's weak point. And maybe you can spot on the right side, in the subtle texture details. It's a little bit hard to see in-game, but the secondary colors and the textures are painted in this very pixelated way. It's embracing that lo-fi aesthetic that formed the foundation of the game's visuals. And then the ancestor designs are a perfect example of how I use like this like low poly style. When people use the term low poly aesthetic, I feel it can mean like one out of two things, like a style of modeling that uses as few polygons as possible, or a modeling style where the polygons or the triads are kept like very visible, so that you can see that's a low poly model. I'm personally not really interested in that. I prefer thinking of it as a minimal style of modeling. Like for me, seeing all the hard edges can end up looking very jarring if you use it everywhere. So because you kind of lose the volumes and the shapes that I'm looking for. So instead, I use different smoothing groups and Phong angles to restrict the visibility of the hard edges. And here you can see that in some examples for the environment and the architecture. So these trench walls in our gray world, like they have these architectural elements carved out of them. But you can see that even though it's rock, like not all of the surface should express those harsh polygons because it just becomes too noisy. And this is the final smoothing used in-game with only a few cracks and hard edges applied here and there to convey rock. And that same principle is applied to our pipe puzzle building we saw earlier. So this is with hard edges everything. And then selective smoothing. It's a bit subtle, I don't know if you can see it. And the final. And then, especially because of these insect-inspired designs, like I wanted the bulbous shapes of beetles, which look way too angular and noisy if they don't get any smoothing at all. So the modeling style, it becomes about finding a nice balance between expressing the volume of the carapace versus the harshness of it. And here in this moon ancestor design, you can see, for instance, that the claws, they work perfect when they are kept very angular and the polygons are kept very visible, which makes sense because they're meant to be sharp like claws. And on the left helmet here, you can see like the main torso and the upper legs, like they're way too polygonal in this state, and they kind of distract from the volumes that I want to express for them. So on the right, I smooth those out, and the antennas and the legs are kept very angular, because for me, like those details and that feeling of harshness seem appropriate for those body parts. And the moon ancestors are kind of like worker drone versions of the regular ancestors or the bosses. So for them, I was thinking of like this juvenile larval state version of the final boss design. So they share somewhat related like visual cues with the main bosses. This one is the moon ancestor for our third boss and our third orb, which is like this very cellular orb. We call that one the teleport orb. And the idea behind its ability is that it can be picked up from any pedestal, as if it like magically teleports there immediately. And we introduce a version of that ability here in the teleport boss arena. And so for this orb ability of teleportation, I wanted to conceptually ground it in something a bit more physical. So I started thinking like, what if it's made in some strange organic manner that can perfectly mimic something instantly at any point? So the idea of like cloning and repetition came to mind, and also made me look at like fractals and cells. And you can see here that with this very organic direction, the style for this world has a lot more rounded and smooth shapes than the previous ones. And I also realized that microscopic cells and invertebrate sea animals like jellyfish, they have something in common that really appeals to me, which is their translucency. And the nice thing about explaining that is that I can have quite simple volumes, but the complexity and the refinement comes from inside of them. So that visual layeredness would also set this wool apart from the previous very rocky ones. And on a planned surface, the concept of repetition becomes very apparent. It's inspired by imagery of like skin cells and scales. And we suggest that this world is trying to mimic being a planet. So that these small organic mountains and organic canyon-like walls and organic grass. And there's even like mimics of worker drones that look like you with like little organic orbs on their backs. And then as you approach the boss arena, there's even like pillars with mimics of the teleport boss. And so for that boss, we knew that the player needed to hit it several times before the round ends. So I thought that would imply that what is underneath that armor is then very delicate, and which fits nicely with the already established look of this world of like the thin membranes and like the blistery structures. And then there's so many marine inspirations in this world already. So I was reminded of like mini submarines. So I thought, okay, like what if this ancestor is inside this mini submarine, but like an organically grown one? And I was playing with the idea of this ancestor remaining in almost infant-like state, a bit like how axolotls don't change as they mature, like they stay in their juvenile form. And because of the world's theme of duplication, I ended up also being inspired by Siamese twins. And so this ancestor ends up looking like very fetal. And just like the entire world, it has like symmetry to its body and is composed of like all these mirrored parts. And so the boss designs, they weren't planned ahead. It was always gameplay first and then visual design later. And the process for our last boss is maybe out of all of them, the most tied to process of developing our last world, which is the sun world. So for this boss, I was thinking about spaceships or space stations, like something that would make sense in a zero-G environment. And then the render in the middle was a bit inspired by the sun god Ra with like the red disc on his head. And on the right, I'm playing with symmetry and mirroring. I'm looking for this stylized star shape to represent its relationship to the sun. And that starship ended up being the final choice for his body. And with his overall body plan, you can kind of quarter his design and come up with 4 like sort of similar looking pieces. Because I was playing with the idea of this boss representing the 4 other worlds in its layout to highlight this one being above them in the hierarchy, as it it embodies the sun at the heart of the solar system. And so for this world, the sun world, Yem and I discussed that maybe this world could look a bit weirder or a bit more abstract, like it's the surface of the sun after all. And so we played with the idea that we'd actually start out on a dormant sun. So just like the other orbs, like this world, this star is held in stasis, and it would get activated step by step as you go through it. And then with each of these activations, it would become brighter and become more energetic, and until ultimately it would become a burning star. And in my research, I was also fascinated by the shapes and patterns that frozen water can form. The radial ice patterns reminded me of magnetic field lines, which I was very fitting because stars that have like these really strong, like intense magnetic fields. So maybe I could somehow represent that. And then the images of the tall frozen columns of ice and columns of air bubbles trapped in the ice, they fit well with the idea of a world that's usually in motion, but is now kept static. So I imagined we could be looking at maybe like plasma that is being held in place, playing with the idea of like the motion of fluids and currents that are halted in time. So in these early concepts, we traverse a dark surface as the sun is still dormant. And maybe the magnetic field could be represented as 2D lines in the atmosphere. So if this world can be like really weird and abstract, like maybe the fields can be stylized to the point that they almost become like a graphical overlay on top of the landscape. And as you saw in the beginning, I was already like embedding like 2D elements into my 3D work. So this seemed fitting. And it was a little bit tricky getting the feel for this world right, because it was so different from the previous ones. And in the end, it was about finding the balance between like the very angular mineral shapes and the round fluid ones that made this world feel very coherent. The entire world is about these wave patterns that are in the mineral and in the air that signify the magnetic field like leaving its imprint everywhere. And then conceptualizing shapes as fluid and gas that's halted in motion, it also gave me an interesting design pillar that unified this world in a very unique way. So here's what some of those biomes ended up looking like. So this is where you start off in the sun. And I thought like this layer being so close to the core of the sun, I imagined gravity would be at its strongest. So we have these black masses that they're like singularity points where the gravity is so intense that it actually pulls the landscape down a bit. So we get this distinct graded look. And then, of course, the design principles of the hive culture are still applied everywhere. So there's circles, and there's the familiar ambiguity of like parts of the landscape looking more like technology and that looks sculpted out of the surrounding material. And of course, the usage of the shiny metals in the filigree. And then the further up we go, the lighting changes dramatically. Like the main light source in this world, it comes from below, and as the sun's core is underneath all these landscapes, like that's the thing that is activating and lighting up, which is very different from the other very terrestrial worlds. So together with the landscape becoming more like floating islands, it makes for a very distinct world. And here we have our lineup of ancestors and the worlds that they've been guarding. So when we've unfolded our solar system, the Orbs identity should still be recognizable in the planet's final looks. So for our organic teleport world, it meant a lot of repeating patterns, and it's very much a system of like circular fractal patterns, and its overall appearance is like reminiscent of a sea urchin. There's like sea urchin designs like everywhere in this game, and it has then these planetary rings like made out of bony structures. And then the gray world is so industrialized in mind that there's like a systematic scarring all over its landscape. And the green world is covered in ocean and mold-like growth. And then the theme of height for the orange world is very apparent in its deep canyons. So that was like a little brief look at the worlds of Cocoon. I think in the end we managed to create some very visually distinct worlds that help with orienting the player within the planet hierarchy while still feeling very coherent together. The insect-inspired design that the game took from the protagonist that helped me a lot with like fleshing out the alien hive culture identity for the game. And then the minimalist and colorful style that I started out with, it changed a lot during development, but I think it was a perfect vessel to convey that sense of playfulness, but also supporting like the weirdness of the game's mechanics, because the game's ideas can be a bit mind-bending and trippy sometimes. So I'm quite happy that we ended up with a visual language that could support that. So before I head off, COCOON is getting a physical and final release at the end of the year, for which we've partnered with I'm 8-Bit and Super Deluxe. And this will include a retail edition for the PS5 and the Switch, and a collector's edition, which will include some new COCOON art. So you can pre-order them now. And if you're interested in playing the game, you can find it on Steam for PC, Switch, Xbox Game Pass, and PlayStation 5. And for the next 3 weeks, you can also play it at Kuma Gallery in Helsinki. And tonight at 6, we're opening a little COCOON exhibition where we'll show some of the production sketches. And so there's also a copy of the game there. So you're very welcome to join us tonight and over the next 3 weeks. So yeah, thank you for your time.
Thank you. All right, so time for questions. So if in the audience there's any questions, raise your hand and the mic will be brought to you, and then we'll ask you to stand up and post your question. But I'll start with one. So how long COCOON was in the development? Like how long of a process it was?
For me, it was 6.5 years, and for Jeb and Jakob, a little bit longer than that.
Yeah?
Yeah.
That's quite long.
Yeah,
right?
a little bit.
Yeah. So how was the team? Like how many people were involved in specifically in the visual parts of the game?
So I was the only artist for like the first year or so. And then how many artists did we end up hiring? 1, 2, 3. And we ended up adding 4 artists just for like the modeling side. A few artists who were only doing like visuals, like I call it like VFX. But also we had some animators who also did like a little bit of both, or did it like multiple things. But yeah, I think like a small team of like 4 or 5 artists, maybe over the entire course of the game.
Right.
I think so.
So it's pretty like, how do you manage the process of getting the same visual style for all the works? Like how does that look like?
So it helped that when, especially with like the last few years, that by the time that we started hiring more people to help me out, a lot of the style and a lot of the work was very much established. So they could actually sort of kit bash from existing areas. So they would expand on the gray world, the green world, and the orange world, because those worlds were so far along. So all they needed to do was like use pre-existing elements, and I would have like notes like, okay, use this element from there, this element from over there. And then while they were doing that, I was developing the purple and the last world.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then as they were as they were working on their stuff, at some point, I would usually go in for like the last like final touches, like like a little crack over here, or a little bit of detail over there. So I've probably touched almost every model in the game at some point, like doing like the final pass, and then it goes back to them to do like a final vertex painting pass within Unity.
Congratulations, an amazing coherent visual style. It's just amazing to play. You feel the world by playing it with all these kind of things that you put in there. Any questions from the audience? There is one there. Let's have a mic there, and then please stand up and voice your comment.
Hi, thank you. It was a very nice presentation. I was wondering, the world is very unique, so where do you find inspiration and references and all this?
The internet. Yeah, I mean, I showed like this one quick sort of like a mood board thingy for the gray world. I like how I talk about it now is more like after the fact, when I'm doing sort of archaeology into my own brain and trying to figure out like what exactly happened at the time. But when I'm like in the process, my process is actually really messy. So I just sort of like dive in and I just start collecting images that I find interesting and writing down keywords like, oh, like this idea or this idea. And then it sort of becomes like a vocabulary in my mind. And then from that, at some point I need to put all those images away again before I actually start developing my own stuff. So it's like images first into my brain, and then I do my own thing. And then I feel like the way that my process works artistically is that I try to remember what I've seen. So I don't use references like right next to my screen, because then I end up trying to make what's there, and I find that really frustrating. So I just have like a visual vocabulary in my head that I try to remember as I'm making like new designs. So there's hardly ever a direct translation between the images that I found and the work that I end up making.
Thank you.
Thank you. I also know that there is that you have a hobby of plants, home plants.
Mm-hmm.
So does any of the plants, did they get into the game that you have at home?
Yeah, I mean, did they? Not necessarily, but I do find like, some plants have like these weird like corrugated structures or whatever. Like I just look at them just as a designer and get inspired by these sometimes really weird shapes. But then when you notice them, it's like, oh, wait a minute, they all have this. It's like, you don't really think about it. So I think that adds to this library of shapes that then I can start to pull from when I start to make new designs.
Mm-hmm. There was another question here from the audience.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. If I understood correctly, this is your first proper game project. So what was like the biggest lesson you took away from it? And in the same vein, if you had to do something differently now, like what would it be?
That's a great question. Yeah.
Oh, my biggest takeaway. I mean, there was so much that I had to learn for all of this, right? Like it's not just only making art. Like things I have to read and it's visual communication at its core, which is close to my education. So I feel that conceptually it's in a way something that I've always done. It's just like the translation from making a poster to making a game that took a little bit of time. So if I would do it differently, I would just want to do it faster, but I wouldn't know how. So yeah.
How was it for you to start from an outsider of games industry to start working with games? Were there?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really think about it in that way. Like I knew of Limbo and Inside, of course. So then I thought I'll just do it. So I've worked on like small games like a little bit before this.
Yeah.
But like one of them didn't even get like a full release. But those are like very small, tiny games.
Yeah.
And now suddenly I was like thrown off the deep end.
Yeah.
maybe that also helped just to push me in there, and then like flailing around and trying to figure things out. That's.
Is there something different in this project that you've had in a previous like visual works or in the smaller game projects that came as a surprise for you?
I think doing everything was the surprise, but also the most fun. So not only having to do environments, but also doing characters, doing technology, doing architecture. I looked at a lot of architecture for this, especially for the Grey World. Like it started off as a very brutalist-inspired world, and then became more and more organic. So I really enjoyed like doing all the different aspects. Whereas in my previous work, I was always approached by clients like, oh, we need a poster for this, or we need like a logo for this, and it's like that was much more specific, and more limited in a way. Whereas here I got the freedom to sort of like unload my brain into this game.
So you got to create an entire world of alien creatures.
And then a lot of talks with Jeppe, like all the time. So we were just like throwing ideas back and forth.
Yeah.
And then I show him something. He's like, "Oh my god, that's cool!" And then we just go with it. And so it's a very like evolving and iterative process. I think it's really fun.
Yeah, and those of you who haven't played Cocoon, it's very kind of interesting how the whole world is conveyed with the imageries only. So there's very little of kind of storytelling with words, and that's kind of the success of you guys working on it together to convey the story. There's one question, at least from the stream. So how does an artist stay inspired and enthusiastic during such a long development time? Was there like a drops of interest at any point?
God, was there? It's difficult to tell if there was any, because it's been so long. Maybe there've been drops of interest, but the thing is, I'm always busy. Like if I'm not doing one thing, then I'm doing another thing. So I did notice with myself, because it's the first time I'm doing such a long project. I've never worked on anything even closely as long as this. What I learned was that if you're stuck somewhere, then there's probably some other design task that will want your attention or that could use some love. So there's a few designs in the game that I worked on it like intermittently because I couldn't get the first time around, and 2 months later I still couldn't get it. Like I forget about this thing, and then at some point it just came together. So me being able to shift my focus on different design aspects that I think that was refreshing for my brain and kept it always really interesting.
Yeah. Was there any more questions from the audience? Okay, so there's one. Okay, let's wait for the mic to come there. And then please stand up to voice your question.
Yeah, my question would be that I find this game like very visually appealing, and like the ideas that you communicated were like very, very new, and you really conveyed an alien world. And I'm just curious, like, what kind of techniques do you think could build such a world? And like, if you would want to start learning something from scratch, like where would you start? What kind of softwares, and what would you keep in mind for that?
I wouldn't focus on software too much. I think my ideas come also from years of just consuming art and media. Like I've watched lots of sci-fi movies, read comics, but I also like going. I really enjoy architecture, photography, ceramics, like different disciplines of art, because it sort of refreshes my design brain, and then some other mind comes up with this visual, and some other mind comes up with that. Like I think that's really cool. So I keep my focus like all over the place. I don't play that many games, maybe to my detriment a little bit, but because there's not enough time in a day. Like there's so many other fields of art that I also want to get a little bit of. But that works for my brain. I don't know if that would work for everyone, but I would encourage people to look at the many disciplines of art that are out there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, one more question from the audience, and then I have a final question. I mean, we're going to move to the next talk pretty soon. So, please stand
I
up.
have a similar question with the chat. It's called like, how do you think the visual design experience help you with the game art?
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. Yes.
How the experience? How do they? That's a good question. I don't know. I think what happened is that where we see the art that I've been making, and then we also know it's like, it's nice, but it could be like a little bit better. And so, yeah, maybe that's something that I learned with this project that's maybe the most useful. Be comfortable killing your darlings. There's a lot of designs that didn't make it into the final game. I think that's a very useful one. Like, of course, you want to give it some love, and you want to see your art sort of like grow up, and you can like steer it like a little bit. And sometimes it just doesn't work out. Okay, we're gonna do something else. Like letting go of some amazing idea. I think that's very useful, and that happened a lot until I became more comfortable in like settling in this like organic sci-fi style, and then that took its own life. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So final question before we go to the next talk is that you're working on something on your own right now. So is the insect things and the plants anything, like you're still continuing with that?
No, it's very,
side?
I mean, it's very early days, but it's sci-fi and that's it. Like there's, I don't think there's any insects so far. No,
okay.
I don't think so.
All right.
Time for something else. Yeah.
Time for other than insects.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Erwin, for your talk.